Hey everyone. So I know that we're already well into our unit on ideology, but over the past week, I've been thinking about ways in that I could connect this abstract concept that is ideology to what's going on in the political world right now. So let's just get to it. I know that some of the videos already available discuss the sources of ideology, but I wanted to make it a little bit more applicable to what we're seeing now. And so I think this is what I'm about to say is going to be a helpful way that we can think about the ways that ideologies are shaped by our motivations as individual people. And by ideologies now, there are different ways of conceptualizing it, as I've discussed in the other videos. But what I mean is just all the different political preferences that an individual person has. And by motivations, remember from the previous units, I mean the deep fundamental underlying goals that we have, whether it's to protect ourselves, maximize the opportunities we have to get rich. But just try this out, right? Ask yourselves, do you personally support any policy that you think in your own head is ultimately harmful for you? Or maybe your social identity group, right? Whatever that might be, your racial group or your gender group or something like that, right? It's highly unlikely, right? To actually support a policy that you think is going to end up harming you. Um, because at some level, our political beliefs and our preferences, two slightly different things, but it's not important right now, align with the stuff that betters ourselves and sometimes at the expense of other people. All right. And this might seem obvious at first, right? You might think, well, yeah, people are generally rational, even though sometimes they might seem irrational. Usually they don't want to actively harm themselves. But okay, just because it's obvious doesn't mean we can't dig a little deeper. And let's explore what that means a little bit because it can actually tell us a lot. It means that a lot of these abstract principles that we use to explain the preferences we have are sometimes, and maybe most of the time, just what are known as post hoc rationalizations, which means that these abstract principles, sometimes what we refer to as ideologies, right? Like a list of kind of formal preferences we have towards politics and the government or whatever, those are adopted by people after they've determined what their motivations are, or not determined consciously, but after they have these motivations of just, self-preservation or advancing their status or something like that, just improving their own personal lives, basically, right? Anything that ends up improving your own personal life or the people or maybe your immediate family or like your social group, whatever, anything that can justify that, might just be what is known as a post hoc rationalization, something that looks really neat and formal and logical or whatever, built on high-minded abstract principles, but in reality it might just be a way of trying to seem like your political opinions aren't just a way to advance your self-interest. The way that these abstract principles look, right? The ones that are trying to that often hide the underlying self-interest that we have, usually they appeal to um, making a better country, right? A better society for everyone. um they'll say, in other words, like, this, I have this policy preference not because it'll benefit me, but I think that it would benefit the rest of the country and society if that policy is implemented. Okay, so let me give you a concrete example of this, like a current events example of this. Do people support Doge? Remember, if you're not following the news and totally under a rock, Doge is the department of the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency. Is it governmental or government efficiency? One of those. Do people support Doge's slashing and burning of various federal agencies because they think that the government is too large and they're ideologically opposed to having a big government, or because the deficits from all this federal spending are too large, or because they think there's too much waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. A lot of people who support Doge will say, yes, these are exactly the reasons why I support what it's doing, right? These are all high-minded ideas that I have because I think that society and the country would function better if we do these things. It doesn't have much to do with me personally. I just think that, this is good for the country and society. Okay, that's fair. But what if you're one of the thousands of people who are laid off by one of these Doge initiatives, right? And you've seen, if you're paying attention, you've seen these stories of people who voted for Trump and are now really pissed off because Doge fired them. Okay. All of a sudden, these people who were fired by Doge but voted for Trump are feeling this tension, right? They're feeling a dissonance, cognitive dissonance. Okay. We've talked about that. Um, they didn't think that they personally were part of the waste, fraud, and abuse, right? They thought, that it was other parts of the federal government that were too big. All right. It's exceedingly rare. They exist, but it's really rare to find someone, for example, like Warren Buffett, who's like, no, actually, you should tax me more, right? It's rare to find someone who wants to do something that is against their personal self-interest, at least in the immediate term. The vast majority of people like the things that they already have and they don't want those things taken away. Okay. In other words, it's kind of self-interest, right? Um, how many people that you know personally that want to get taxed more, right? I personally don't know any. Okay. The thing is, having a lot of these people, having the middle class taxed more and the working class, whatever, having them all taxed more would definitely help control inflation. All right. And that's good for the economy and that's good for the country overall, right? Why isn't that situated within people's abstract, high minded principles that they use to justify the political preferences that they have, right? Their real political preference is usually at least keep the taxes as they are. Don't tax them, don't tax me more, but usually it's tax me less, right? That's the political preference that they have. But that's not necessarily better for the country, right? There are times where it might be better to get taxed less for the middle class to be taxed less. But in times of inflation, generally speaking, yeah, it might be helpful to tax the middle class a little bit more. And that's not, I mean, tax everybody more. But, I'm just kind of trying to drive this point home a little bit. Again, it's exceedingly rare to find people who are willing to sacrifice something that they already have because of some abstract principle like the greater good of the country or society or something like that. They exist, but they're rare. These kinds of people, again, who are willing to harm themselves at least in the short term because they think that doing so will benefit the country. The differences between long-term self-interest and short-term self-interest have a lot to do with the kinds of policies that people support. By short-term self-interest, we're usually talking about self-interest that doesn't really consider the effects that policies will have on other people's well-being or society's well-being. Remember, these kinds of considerations are often just post hoc rationalizations that are used to justify advancing someone's self interest. Let me give you an example. In the short term, you might want low taxes for yourself because you'll just get more money in your pocket. But since these policies affect a lot of people, policies aren't just made for one person in mind, it could lead to more inflation later on because more people have more money in their pockets. It's demand pull inflation, which we'll get to later. But that ends up hurting you in the long run because everything becomes more expensive. So in the short term, you got what you wanted, lower taxes, you have more money in the pocket. But in the long term, because inflation went up, you actually, in effect, have less money in your pocket. or maybe not as much as you thought you did just because of your tax cut. And this leads to my second point. How do we know, or at least how do we think that we know, what's in our own self-interest? So let's just address the claim again that I stated earlier, right? That the vast majority of people do not support policies that they think will harm them. Let's look at another example. Let's look at someone who opposes a strong social safety net, also known as a welfare system. And they might oppose it because they think that government's involvement in their life and other people's lives is actually harmful to them. Okay. They think that. So, in other words, because they have this idea that government involvement in their life through welfare is harmful, then because they have this self interest, they're going to oppose it. Okay. And again, in the as to the earlier point, they'll try to make the case, well, the rest of the country is harmed if a welfare state exists, but I already kind of established that point. We don't need to go there. They might say that it prevents people or them as an individual from facing challenges by themselves and developing into an independent, capable individual. Okay. And that sounds pretty good, right? There's a lot of truth to that, right? People do develop a lot of skills and a lot of independence by dealing through things largely, maybe not entirely by themselves, but largely by themselves. Sure, okay. The logical political preference that emerges from that idea, though, is not as obvious as it might seem to people who are raised in a like a super individualist culture. Okay. The idea that in order to develop your own independence and develop your own skills means that the government shouldn't be involved in different aspects of life, right? That's not actually a logical conclusion. Okay. Um, the reason people jump to that conclusion actually has a lot to do with the history of how that idea kind of emerged and what other kinds of interests in society tried to get that idea instilled into people's minds so that it makes them think that it's actually in their self-interest to get the government away from them. Okay. But I'll get to that. Okay. Think about it this way. In most careers, you'll need social skills, you need critical thinking skills, and often you need to know how to compete against your peers. That's just capitalism. Okay. That's the world we live in, whether you like it or not. Those are all things that the government can and does help to develop into people, right? You might not like school, but often it's in a public school system where people go to get social skills. They might not learn anything about trigonometry or calculus, but they will socialize with their friends, hopefully. And if they join a sport that's sponsored by that schooling system, right, they'll learn how to be competitors and they'll translate that competitive spirit into the private sector or wherever they go in their careers. Okay. These are things that, again, this, if we're talking about a public school system, is funded by the government, okay, by taxes, and with it people can develop skills that they will use later in life, even if those aren't obvious skills related to the things that they sit down and you know nominally study in the classes that they take. It is an outcome that emerges if you go to school, and not everybody can afford private school, so it helps for people who can't afford it. This is an example of how the interests of the government and the interests of like the private sector and the interests of regular people can actually align really nicely. The private sector, private businesses, they want a skilled labor force, a lot of them at least. Okay. They want their employees to be ready to do the job. Okay. And if the employees are ready to become managers or get hired as managers, they want those managers to be skilled and capable of doing, the thinking and the socializing that is usually required if you're a manager. And eventually, they want CEOs and other people on the executive boards with those skills as well. Okay, because it helps get revenue for the business. All right. Again, these are all things that can be provided with government funding. And the government wants those things as well because, if we're talking about self-interested politicians, usually people are happy if they get good jobs and the economy's doing well and et cetera, et cetera. So they get reelected and they get what they want. Okay. So all of these interests are aligning. And you might be thinking, okay, this you're painting too much of a rosy picture here. And you're not wrong. Here's what's really interesting. Some people uh, think that if you expand the pool of potential skill of potentially skilled people by giving them, giving more and more people the opportunity to develop these skills, by ensuring that yes, with government funding, that they have good schools, they have safe and clean neighborhoods where they don't feel trapped in a cycle of poverty, they don't feel worthless, they don't feel like if they keep trying nothing's going to happen, right? Instead they feel that all the effort that they put in is actually worth it, and they'll get something, if by putting in that effort, right? Then they might enter into the pool of possible skilled people in society, right? And in the previous version of the story, they would fit nicely into all these businesses that are ready to hire them and all that stuff. That's great. But what you also might be doing is creating more competition for yourself. If there are more people getting these skills, that means that there are more people than there otherwise would be who are ready to take some of your business away. Now, if you are purely self-interested, you would probably want to balance the amount of opportunity that people have in society so that you get just enough opportunity so that just enough people get skilled and whatever to fit the roles that you need in your company, but you don't want to get too much opportunity in there to avoid other people starting their own businesses and eating into your profits. But that's if you're purely self-interested. If you're interested in having a healthy economy where you have a lot of healthy competition, then you would be like, no, we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. So we're getting as many skilled people into the private industry as possible, the private sector as possible, right? But I'll get back to that in a bit. Okay. From that perspective, having the government step in is not is not antithetical to personal growth, right? It's not antithetical to having a strong society or economy, right? It's actually conducive to those things. The idea that it always steps in and prevents people from developing these skills, developing independence, is kind of a joke. Okay. A lot of people who claim that the government prevents personal growth don't have much to say about the amount of advantages that a lot of people have in society today because of the centuries of having government prefer those communities over other communities. Okay. So the existing inequalities between communities, between different genders, between different racial groups, right, often have to do with the government giving some communities, some groups benefits to developing skills, to having the opportunity to develop wealth and all that stuff. And the history tells us very clearly that if the government gives you that opportunity, then or gives you the space, gives you all the tools that you need to build yourself up, right? Then you can do it. It's not a simple, government bad, government good, as history just tells us straight out, okay? All of a sudden, right? Seemingly when the government starts to do a little bit on the margins to better communities that haven't traditionally been favored by the government, okay? This idea that governments are harmful to personal growth or to community development start to ascend, okay? They start to like conveniently emerge out of the blue, okay? It seems a little too convenient that people are suddenly opposed to big government when the government is starting to serve more than just the interests of the already dominant in society. Here's my final point. The government is not just, and I've already addressed this a little bit, but I'm going to focus on this part now. The government isn't just some big monolithic thing that can only do bad and only do good, okay? And neither is the private sector, okay? There are some bad policies. Some government policies have bad parts and have good parts, okay? Just as there are some companies that would actually benefit from having a really, really dumb populace so that they can spend like $0 on marketing research and just sell their products to unassuming customers who don't know any better, right? Other companies or just private interests in general just want less competition, as I was saying before, right? A lot of companies just want to monopolize their industries. They want to be the only producer and seller of their goods because they can maximize their profits that way. And I hope that most people realize that businesses avoid becoming monopolies because laws prevent them from doing so, not out of the goodness of their hearts. Okay. What this means is if a lot of private industries have an incentive and like a self-interest in minimizing the skills that people have and the education and information that people have, okay, which they do. Many, not all private industries do, but many of them do have an interest in keeping people dumb and limiting the amount of skills that people develop to limit competition, okay? If these interests and incentives exist, then they would want to get people trapped in cycles of poverty. They will be incentivized to actively prevent people from developing the skills that they would need to compete with them. Okay, because again, for a lot of industries, this will give them an advantage. Okay, this will maximize their profits. These incentives exist. We can't just ignore that they exist. All right. These are the same self-interests that individual people have, which leads to their political preferences, right? They just exist for private industries, private companies. They have a self-interest in maximizing their profits. So many of them will actively try to get the government to prevent people from getting opportunities to develop skills, to keep people trapped in cycles of poverty so that they can limit the amount of competition that they face. Okay. But also what they can do is they can convince people in the public, regular people, that the government can only harm them by concocting this compelling story about how government intervention is just like having someone hold your hand your entire life so you can't develop as an independent person. These companies that are anti-competition, um, pro-monopolization, right? Uh, they will do whatever they can to make sure that this story is told and that people believe it. Okay, because they want their self-interest is to get government out of the way. Okay, again, even though the government can and has historically actually helped people become independent, skilled, and productive members of society, right? Uh, if these industries can convince enough people that government can't do those things, then they get those people to just sign off on allowing these private industries to maximize their power and profits at other people's expense, at regular people's expense. Okay. And here's the last thing. You might think, well, you can tell the same exact story about how the government and politicians convince us to support their efforts to become more powerful. Maybe a lot of politicians are incentivized to keep the populace dumb and dependent on them, right? Because then they could draw more power from that. They have their own self interest to do that. And that's also true. Like I said, this isn't, a black or white story, left versus right, good or bad. Okay. We need to be cautious about all of these things. We need to be cautious about the interests of government and the interests of private industry. And as regular people, we all have an interest in making sure that both of these systems work in our benefit. That's what it is. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense, right? We would be so far removed from our own self interest, we would be living in la la land. I think what I hope I'm saying, I hope what I'm saying is not partisan or controversial in any way. I think that this is kind of straightforward, but ideology, in the sense, in the conventional sense, in the sense of like worldviews and believing these kinds of stories that people make about how government's bad or how private industry is always bad. These ideologies, these kinds of ideologies, these stories, oftentimes false, have driven people to believe that what is actually in their own self-interest is not in their self-interest and is actually harmful to them. They've taken us so far away of like just kind of level-headed evaluations of government and the economy and private industry, that people are just like, government always bad, smash everything with a hammer, even though everything, part of that everything, right, that they want to get smashed includes stuff like cancer research and disease prevention mechanisms, strategies that help prevent another pandemic from happening. All right, so my point here is not that Doge supporters or MAGA endorse the cutting of cancer research and biomedical research or something like that. Although many do, that's not my point. The point is that most people, when they justify whatever Doge is doing, will just refer to another story that they were told, which is that the private sector can do a lot of whatever the government does, but better and cheaper. Okay, but the thing is, this is, again, just something that these private interests desperately want us to believe. Like, very convenient to have people to believe this because it will make them profit. If they can get enough people in a democracy to support handing them more money, why wouldn't they? All right. The bigger point here is that private companies are less accountable to the public than the government is. No one votes on the people who run these companies, so if they are harming a large swath of the country, not as much can be done compared to situations where voters can punish or reward their governments for good or bad behavior. And if these industries make more money after the government hands them some of its own functions, then they will, guess what, develop even more money and more power that they can use to influence people into believing that they should want to privatize everything that the government does. All right, it's a big fat circle. And they can convince people that even the bad things that they do, that these companies do, are actually good for them. Take healthcare insurance for an example, right? It's allowed to be privatized. It's something that most other, if not all other, advanced industrialized countries have the government just fund, okay, through whatever systems that they have, taxes or whatever. It doesn't matter. These healthcare insurance companies literally make money by denying people healthcare. that they need, sometimes that they need to actually survive. And the thing is, you can't even justify this kind of a system by it being cheaper or having better outcomes for Americans. It's not cheaper when we compare it to the countries that have government funded healthcare insurance. The US spends more money than all of them, than every other developed country. And it has worse outcomes than every other developed country. Spends more money in a private healthcare insurance system, has worse health outcomes than every other developed, lower life expectancy than every other developed country. But people like RFK Jr. will say that Big Pharma is evil because they make money off of keeping people sick, but he won't do diddly squat about fixing the broken healthcare insurance system, which systematically prevents people from getting healthy so that some millionaires and billionaires can make more money. And too many um, supporters of Trump and Doge and the administration more generally are too caught up in the stories that they were told and too caught up, honestly, in owning the libs to notice the fact that the real problems in the system are not being addressed. The most important thing is that there has been a long tradition of passing down these stories, these ideological stories of how, government bad or even private industry bad, whatever it is, that become so ingrained in our understanding of society and our perceptions of how the world works that we believe them to be true, and they dislodge us, they disconnect us from what is actually in our own self-interest. Now you might think, no, I think people need to be dumb, or I think that it's okay that a certain segment of the population, whether it's women or black people or Latinos or whatever, they need to be kept in positions and or like, oh, I don't need to, I don't want to racialize it. So just people who are already poor, they need to pull themselves up from their bootstraps, or else they deserve what they get in life, right? They deserve to be born in neighborhoods that are totally run down, and the government clearly hasn't given a shit about them for generations. Those are part of some weird ideological story that certain interests in society that aren't ordinary people want us to believe, and it benefits them, not ordinary people. So it might seem like this is like a partisan thing, but if you think about it, what I'm saying here is actually totally, it transcends partisanship. It transcends left versus right. I'm literally saying sometimes the government can be good, sometimes it can be very bad. Sometimes that private industry can be good, sometimes it can be very bad. But but the reason why people think only one, only good, or only bad is because they have been propagandized, all right, by these stories that are just not true.